Serverless functions allow us to deploy our code to the cloud without having to worry about the underlying infrastructure. In theory, this means that our functions can scale infinitely and your build will only scale with your usage. This means that you don't have to provision expensive infrastructure before you have any users. Having your serverless provider deploy these functions to the edge means that your functions are going to be running close to your user, and this means lower latency. However, a major issue with serverless functions is that they need to start up every time that they run. So if you have a slow connection to something that's meant to live for a long time, like a database, this means we need to spend time creating that connection before we can execute the function. So what if we could connect to our database with a different protocol, like HTTP? This would mean that we get the best of both worlds. We can have a long-lived connection to our database that's up and ready to use every time we execute our function. This is what the team at Neon have been working on, and I'm excited to show you just how easy it is to get started with Neon's serverless driver and Vercel Edge functions. Neon have been kind enough to sponsor this video, however, everything that they have built is open source and available on their GitHub. So if you like the technology but you don't want to use Neon, that's also perfectly fine. Neon offers serverless Postgres with a very generous free tier. If you would like to follow along with this video, please make sure you have a Neon account by following the link in the description below. So in this video, we're going to build and deploy a full stack application to the edge with Neon serverless driver and Vercel Edge functions. Let's dive in and get started building this project. So I'm here in VS Code and I'm going to bootstrap a new project with pnpm create next app. And I'm going to call mine comment anon. And would I like to use TypeScript? I'm going to select yes. Would I like to use ESLint? I'm also going to select yes. I'm going to select yes to Tailwinds. Would I like to use a source directory? Yes. And would I like to use the app router? In this case, I'm going to select no. So would you like to customize the default import alias? Nope. So I'm going to cd into comment anon, and then I'm just going to open this up in its own Visual Studio window. If you have a look in the description below, you'll see a link to a GitHub repository. Inside of that GitHub repository, you're going to see this folder called SQL, and this is the SQL that we need to run to create our tables. So you can see that we have two very simple tables. We have a page, just has one value, and that is going to be a handle, and then we have a comment. So let's go over to Neon, and we can start by creating our database, and we can create these tables as well. So I'm here on neon.tech, but if you'd use my link in the description below, that way Neon know that you came to the website through my video. So we can click sign in here, and then we can just sign in with GitHub. So I have two projects here already, but I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to call this comments anon. And I think we made it comment, so I'm going to call it comment anon. And then I'm just going to select a region that is close to me. So I'm going to select Singapore. And Neon have also been working on a CLI tool. I'm not going to use that CLI because I want to show you just how easy it is to use Neon through their interface on the website. So once we've created our project, we're going to get a connection string here. I want to make sure that I have the pooled connection string here, and I'm just going to copy that. The next thing I'm going to do is to come back to VS Code, and I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this .env.local. And inside of .env.local, I'm going to paste my connection string, and I'm going to call this database URL. And that's going to equal my string here. And we can also get rid of these there. So make sure you have your database URL, and it is the pooled connection string. So if we come back to Neon, we can go to the SQL editor, and we can paste in our create table SQL here, and we can run this. And you should see that the request completed successfully. Let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to get the SQL for our comments table. Again, come back to Neon, paste that in, and run this. And you should also see requests completed successfully. Okay, now let's click over to tables, and we should see two tables here, our page and our comment. Let's expand page. You can see that we have our handle, and you can see that we also have our comment table here as well. So the next thing we want to do is to deploy our application. So I'm going to do that with the Vercel CLI. So the first thing that I need to do is to install the CLI. So I can say pnpm i-g Vercel, and this is going to install the CLI globally. So wherever I am on my machine, I'm going to be able to use this CLI. So the next thing that I want to do is run Vercel login. Now I want to continue with GitHub because I sign into Vercel with GitHub. If you use any of these other authentication methods, then you're going to want to select that. This is going to redirect and it's going to say that I logged into the CLI successfully. So the next thing to do is to deploy. So to do that, I can simply run Vercel, and then it's going to run me through some steps where I can set up my deployment. So I want to deploy my comments anon. I want to deploy it to my Tom Nagel account, and it's going to ask me if I want to link to an existing project. I'm going to select no. What's my project's name? I'm just going to call it comment anon. In which directory is your code located? That is my current working directory, /. Do I want to modify these settings? No. And let's start deploying. So you can see that I get this inspect link here, and this is going to be my current deployment. So let's open that up, and you can see here that it is currently building. And I'll get a link here that I can visit the website. Okay, our website has been deployed. We can visit it. We get a nice little preview here. Let's click visit. And you can see that this is our application up and running. Okay, let's close this. And let's go build out an Edge function to create a page. So I'm going to come into my source directory, and inside of pages, you're going to see an API folder. Inside of API, you're going to see one file called hello, and we're going to overwrite this to create our page. So let's rename this pages, because we're going to follow REST principle. And so REST says that your resource needs to be plural. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to tell Next and Vercel that we want this function to run on the edge. And that's actually extremely simple. So we can export a const config, and that's going to equal an object. And now I'm going to say my runtime, and that's going to be edge. This is runtime. Now Vercel is going to know that we want to run this function on the edge. So before we go any further, let's install some dependencies. I'm going to say p npm add, and I want to add the Neon serverless driver. So this is at Neon database /serverless. I also want to install Zod. And because we're going to be using SQL responsibly, I'm also going to install SQL string. So now we can start up our development server with pnpm dev. And then we should be able to go to localhost port 3000. And you can see our application here. Let's go to /API/pages. So we get an error here, and that is because we've selected Edge as our runtime, but we're not using Edge functions here. So let's go back to VS Code and fix this. So our request here is actually going to be a next request, and this comes from next/server. And then our response here is also going to be a next fetch event, and this also comes from next/server. And we can import these as type because they're just interfaces. And next fetch event is not a generic, so we can remove that. And then let's just delete this data type here. Okay, so you can see that TypeScript is helping us out. Res.status is not a function. So we need to return a new response. And inside of that response, I want to put this object, and then I'm going to say my status is just a 200. Okay, so let's delete this res.status. And you can see that TypeScript is complaining, and that's because we need to return a string. So let's stringify this JSON, json.stringify. You can save that, and let's go try this out again. Refresh this page, and you can see that we get back our name, and our name is John Doe. So this might look a little bit different to what you're used to with, say, normal Node.js functions and even Next API routes. And that's because the Edge runtime only has a limited selection of APIs that you can use. The Vercel website has a list of all the APIs that you can use. Okay, so the next thing is to connect to our database. So the way that we connect to our database is just like you would connect to any Postgres pool, but instead we're going to use the Neon serverless driver, and this is going to handle the magic for us in the background. So I'm going to import pool from @Neon, and this is going to be /serverless. And pool is a constructor, so it needs a capital P. Next, I'm going to say const pool is equal to new pool. And then pool is going to take an object, and we're going to say our connection string is going to be process.env. And we need to get our database URL from our local env here. So the next thing we need to do is to construct an SQL string. So I'm going to say const SQL is equal to, and I'm going to give this backticks here. And I just want to put in some basic SQL to check this out. So I'm going to say select now. So the next thing we need to do is to execute this SQL. So I'm going to say const is equal to await pool dot query, and then I want to pass in my SQL. Our function here needs to be an async function because we are using await. Okay, so this is going to return rows. And we can say const now is equal to rows. And we can get the 0th row. So in our response here, let's return now. And I want to name this now. So I can actually just get rid of this key here. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to end our connection. So we can call pool.end and we can execute that. The issue with this is we're going to wait for our connection to end until we send this response here. So instead of response up here, we can get our event, or we can just rename this to event because this is actually a next fetch event. And event has a property called wait until, and wait until is not going to block our response. It's actually going to continue responding, and then it's going to call this pool.end. So let's go back over to our browser and see what this edge function returns. So we can refresh here, and you can see that we get an object with now, and this took a little bit of time to respond, but if we refresh this now, you can see that it's actually going to be really fast. The reason for this is because we had a cold startup. This means that our function hadn't been hit in a while, and we needed to start it back up. This is not going to be a problem once you start acquiring users and your functions are continuously hit. So the next thing we need to do is to add our database connection string to our Vercel environment variables, because Vercel right now doesn't know what our database URL is going to be. So we can open up a new terminal here, and I can use the Vercel CLI. So I can say Vercel env ls, and this is going to list out all the environment variables that we're currently using. And of course we have none. So now we can say Vercel env add, and I want to call my environment variable database URL, and then it's going to ask me what the value is going to be, and I can copy this string here and I can paste that in. So now you need to select the environment that this environment variable should be used for. So I'm going to select production, preview, and deployment. You probably should use a different database connection string for each environment. Okay, so now I've added my variable to comment anon. The next thing that I need to do is to deploy this. So I'm just going to say Vercel, and then this is going to create a new deployment for us. So we got our preview URL here. Let's click on that and open this up. We get our page just like we did before. Let's go to /API/pages. Again, this is going to take just a second to load because the function is cold. We can refresh this and you can see that it's much faster, and you can see that we actually have a connection to our database because our database is telling us what the current time is. So the next thing we need to do is we need to get a handle out of the request body, and then we need to create a page for that given handle. So before we do that, I want to extract this logic here out into a different function. So if we don't get a post request, I can send back a 405 saying, hey, we don't accept that method on this route. So let's say async function create page handler. This is just going to get our request and our event. Now we can copy all of this up into this function. We can spell handler correctly. Now I want to say if request.method is equal to post, then I want to return my create page handler. I want to pass in my request and my event. Otherwise, down the bottom here, I'm going to copy this response, and I want to return a 405 because a 405 means that we don't accept this method. So if we get a post request, for example, we don't want to accept that method. We just want to return our 405. And I'm just going to return a string saying invalid method. Okay, so I want to get my body. So I want to say const body is equal to request.body. And let's just console.log this. So I can say console.log body. So I'm going to use Thundercline here, but you can also use Postman. It's really up to you. So I'm going to send a post request to /API/pages. Inside of my body, I'm going to have one property, and that's going to be handle, and it's just going to have any string value. So let's clear this out and send this along. And you can see that we are logging our request body here, but our request body isn't an object, it's actually a readable stream. So we're going to have to extract our JSON from this readable stream, and we can create a little function that is going to help us do that. So I'm going to say async function extract body. So this function is going to take one argument, and that's going to be our request. And the type of this is going to be next request. So if we don't have a request.body, I just want to return null. So I want to say if not rec.body, let's just return null. And that's just a little sanity check here to make sure that we do have a request body to extract the JSON from. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is create a text decoder. So I say const decoder is equal to new text decoder. And these are all web APIs that we're using here. And of course, that's all you can use inside of these edge functions. I'm going to say const reader is equal to request.body.getReader. And I want to say let's body is equal to just an empty string. And I want to say while true. Then I want to extract our done and add value. So I say const object done and value is equal to await reader dot read. So I say if done. So if we're finished reading the readable stream, I want to return JSON.parse, and I want to return the body. So our body here should be a string of JSON, and we should be able to call JSON.parse. But of course, we know that JSON.parse can throw an error, and so we need to try and catch that error. So let's wrap this in a try catch. I'm going to get the error here. I'm just going to console.log this error. So console.error, log it out here, and I just want to return null. So this here is our base case. When we get done, we're going to return out of this function. If we're not done, what we want to do is we want to append a decoder value onto this body value here. So let's say body is equal to body plus decoder.decode, and I just want to decode the value. Let's tidy this up a little bit. And now we should be ready to use this function. So instead of just logging out our request body here, we can wrap this in extract body. And this needs to be awaited. And this doesn't take request body, it just takes our request object. So let's clear out a terminal here, send this off again. And you can see that we get our body with handle of 1. And of course, we get back our database's current time. So I don't really trust anything that the user sends to this function. I don't want them to send a bunch of SQL and try create an SQL injection attack. I want to pass what they send me through a schema, and I'm going to use Zod to do that. So I'm going to say const schema is equal to Z, and we need to import Zod. So import Zod from Zod. And this is going to be z.object, and our object is just going to have one property, and this is going to be handle, and of course it's going to be a string. And let's say its max length is going to be 64. And the min, let's say that that is going to be 2. Actually, let's say 1. So let's say const is equal to schema.parse. And I want to parse my body, and then we can get our handle out of there. So if they send us something that doesn't pass through this schema, they're going to get back an error. You probably should handle that error, but I can't be bothered. If we want to have a look what it does, we can try it out here, and you can see that you just get this HTML here. That's perfectly fine for now. So if they get to this section here, it means that we're good to start up a connection, and we can start inserting the page into our pages table. So inside of our SQL here, I'm going to say insert into page, and I want to insert my handle, and the values is just going to be a question mark for now. So I'm going to use SQL string, and we need to import that. Import SQL string from SQL string. And we need to install some types for this because this is quite an old package. So let's say pnpm add at type/SQL string, and we'll install that as a development dependency. Now SQL string takes 2 arguments. The first argument is going to be our SQL, and then the second argument is going to be the actual values. And the actual value that we want to put in here is going to be handle. And then we need to call the .format, so SQL string .format, and this is going to format this SQL for us. So we don't want to return now, let's just return the user's handle back to them so we can do a redirect to that page. So I don't want to get the rows here, and so I don't need this rows value. So we can just say await pool.query, and then we can query that value. Let's send this off, and I want to create a handle with 1. So I have a little error in my SQL here. I need to wrap this in some brackets, and then I probably should terminate the SQL as well. We can actually log this out. So let's console.log SQL, and we can see what the SQL string format does for us. So this is going to insert into pages a handle, and then it's going to put in our value for us. And that's just going to make sure that it's in the correct format, in that it's a string and not some regular expression or some SQL injection attack. Okay, you can see we got back our handle here. Let's go over to Neon and make sure this is actually in our database. So we can come over to tables, and we can click on page, and we should see 1 row in here for our handle, which has a value of 1. Let's create a new one. Let's say this is a handle like that. Send this along. We get it back, refresh our table here, and we can see that we have a new value of this string here. So the next thing we want to be able to do is to create a comment on that page, and then to be able to list out the comments for a given page. So inside of our API folder here, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this comments.ts. And in here, we're going to have 2 functions. So I'm going to say async function create comment handler. And I'm going to have another function for async function read comments handler. And we also need to make sure we don't forget to set our edge. And we also need to make sure we don't forget to set our runtime to edge. So I'm going to export const config is equal to an object. I'm going to say runtime, and we're going to set that to edge. So the first handler that I'm going to work on is this create comment handler. So we have a request, and we also have our event, and we can type these out. Request is going to be next request. An event is going to be next fetch event. The next thing we want to do is to extract our body. If we go back to pages here, we can see that we created this function to extract our body, but we want to reuse this function. So let's move this into a utility. So I'm going to cut that. I'm going to create a new folder inside of source, and I'm going to call this utils. I'm going to create a new file inside of utils called extract body.ts. Paste this in, and then I'm going to export, and we need to import our next request interface here. Let's go import that into our pages file so we don't break that. Now we can reuse this inside of our create body handler. So I'm going to say const body is equal to await extract body, and we can pass our request into extract body. Now we need a schema to pass our body through, just like we did when we created a page. So I'm going to import Zod from Zod, and then I'm going to create a schema with Zod. So const, and I'm going to call this create comment schema is equal to Zod.object. Now in here, we're going to have a page. This is going to be Z.string. And we should make this the same as the page schema. So we have a max of 64 and a min of 1. So let's copy that and we can paste that on. Next thing we're going to have is a comment. I'm going to say Z.string. And I'm going to say the max here is 256 for no particular reason. Next thing we want to do is to parse our body through this schema. So I'm going to say const object is equal to create comment schema dot parse, and then I want to parse my body. So we can extract out of here our comment and our page. Okay, so you may be thinking that the first query that we need to do is to check and see if the page exists, and if it doesn't, then return a 404. But we don't need to do that check. If we come and have a look at the comment schema, you can see here that we're referencing a page, and so our database is going to do this check for us when we try to create a comment. So the first property on our comment here is an ID, and this is a UUID. So inside of Node, we have a handy package called crypto, and inside of crypto, we have a method called random UUID. But of course, this is an edge function and we don't have access to the crypto package. So to be able to create a UUID, we're going to have to install a new package called UUID. So I'm going to say p npm add UUID, and I'm going to import v4 as UUID v4. And we may also need to install some types for UUID. So I'm going to grab that and say p npm add at types /UUID. And I'm going to install this as a development dependency. Okay, so now we can create our ID. So const ID is equal to UUID v4, and then we're just going to execute that. The next thing we need to do is to create a query for creating a comment. So I'm going to say const create comment query is equal to SQL string, and I need to import SQL string. Import SQL string from SQL string dot format. And then we're going to pass in a string, and then we're going to pass in an array of our arguments here. So the query is going to be insert into comment, and then we're going to supply the arguments that we want to insert. So we want to insert our ID, our page, and our comment. Then we need to supply those actual values. So the first value is going to be our ID, our page, and our comment. And then we need to say values, question mark, question mark, question mark. So what we're doing here is we're telling SQL, hey, I want to insert into comment these values here, and then we're telling SQL format, replace these question marks with these values that we supply in this array. The next thing we can do is to create a connection pool. So I'm going to say const pool is equal to new pool. We can supply our connection string, and this is going to be process.env.database URL, and I'm going to copy that to make sure I spell it correctly. You could create a little utility for making database connections a little bit easier, but we've only done it 3 times, so I think it might be a little bit early for that abstraction. Okay, so let's try and catch this. Inside of try catch, I want to say await pool.query, and then I want to pass in my query. So create comment query. And then I just want to return new response. My new response is going to have my JSON.stringify, and I just want to return the ID of the comment. We're not actually going to use this ID, but it might be nice just to return what it is that you created. If we catch an error, I just want to console.error, and I'm just going to log that error out. And I'm also going to return a new response. My response is going to say page not found. And then the status code is going to be 404. You could, of course, test this error here to make sure that the error that you're getting is because the page doesn't exist, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that that is the error that we're running into. And then the last thing we need to do is to end our pull connection. So if we catch an error or we succeed here, I want to end our pull connection regardless. So let's use the finally keyword. And I'm going to say event.waitUntil. Then I'm going to pass in my pool.end. Okay, so we have our create comment handler here. The next thing to do is to go and use this handler. So I'm going to say const handler is equal to an async function. Actually, I'm going to use the function keyword. Get rid of all this. And we need to make sure the function is async. We're going to get our request and our event. So let's just copy that out of our create comment handler. And I want to say if rec.method is equal to post, then we know that we're trying to create a comment. So I'm going to return create comment handler, pass in my request and the event. Then I want to say if rec.method is equal to get, this means that we're trying to get the comments for a page. Then I'm going to return read comments handler, pass in the request and the event. So let's copy these and pass these up into read comments handler, just so TypeScript is happy. Otherwise, I want to return a new response. And that response is going to say invalid method. And I'm going to give a status of 405. Okay, so let's start our development server back up with pnpm dev. And then I'm going to go over to Thunder Client and try to create a comment. So we're going to send a post request to localhost port 3000/API/comments. We're going to give it some comment text, and I know that page 1 exists. So let's send this off, and we expect a UUID to come back, but instead we get an error. And the reason is because we haven't exported a default function from our API route here. So this handler function here, we need to export this as default. So export defaults handler. Let's try this again. We get back a UUID here. This took 3 seconds. Let's try send this again and see how long it takes. So now it took 547 milliseconds, which is of course 6 times faster. And that's because our function is now warm. So the last thing that we need to implement is this read comments handler. So let's go ahead and do that. So I just want to be able to make a request to this URL with the page inside of a query string. So to get the query string out, we need to get it out of our search params. So I'm going to say const object is equal to new URL. And then inside of URL, I want to pass in my request.url. And this is going to turn it into a URL object. And from there, we can get out our search params. Then we can say const page is equal to search params.get. And then I want to get out the page. I can say if not page, then let's return a new response. And I'm just going to say page not found. And we can give this a status of 404. The next thing we need to do is to create a pool and our get comment query. So I'm going to say const pool is equal to new pool. Again, our connection string is going to be process.env.database URL. And let's make sure we did spell that correctly, and we did. So I'm going to say const get comments query is equal to SQL string dot format. I'm going to pass in a string to format. And the query here is going to be select ID, comment, and created at from comment where page is equal to a question mark. And then I want to order by created at, and I want that ordering to be descending. So we're going to see the new comments first. And we're going to have one argument in here, and this is just going to be our page. So this page here is going to get swapped out for this question mark. So let's wrap this in another try catch. And we're going to need finally as well. So we may as well put that in. So I want to try const is equal to await pool.query. I'm going to pass in my get comment query. And then I want to return a new response. And from our pool.query, we're going to get our rows. And I'm going to rename that to comment rows. And I just want to JSON.stringify our comment rows. Okay, if we get an error, let's just return a 404 again. So I'm just going to console.error and log that error out. And I want to return a new response. And I'm just going to say page not found and assume that is the issue. And I want to give this a status of 404. And then finally, we need to end our connection pool. So I'm going to say event.waitUntil and then call pool.end. So let's go make a GET request to this URL. So I'm going to open up another Thunder client. And then I'm going to add a query string on here. And this is going to be page is equal to 1. Send this. So you can see when we send this query here, we get back an array of our comments. Let's go create another comment. So this is going to be another comment. Send this off. We get back our UUID. It's a query for these comments. And we get another comment here and it's at the top as we expect. So the next thing to do is to build a user interface around these edge functions. So I'm just going to be building a very simple user interface around this application just to demonstrate its functionality without having to use Thunder Client or Postman. So let's go over to our Explorer and I'm going to open up the index and we can close Thunder Client now. I'm going to remove everything inside of the main tag here. And then I'm also going to remove the class names from the main tag. And we can remove all this stuff as well. We don't need any of that. So I'm just going to create a h1 tag. And then this h1 tag is going to say ask anonymously. And then I'm going to have a very simple form that the user can fill in to create a page. So on the index page, we're going to be able to create pages and then it's going to redirect to their comment section and then they can share that page with other people so other people can leave anonymous comments. Before we go any further, let's install React Query. So I'm going to say npm add React Query. And then I'm going to create a query provider inside of our _app directory here. So I'm going to import from React Query. And I want to import a query client and a query client provider. I want to create a query client and then we can use that query client inside of the provider. So I'm going to say const query client is equal to new query client. And then we can wrap this component here inside of this query client provider. Let's create a component there. And then we can close that tag there. Now our query client provider needs a client and we can use our query client there. Now React Query is ready to use. So instead of our home component, I can create a mutation that we can use with our form. So I'm going to say const mutation is equal to use mutation, and use mutation comes from React Query. Now we need to provide a mutation function. So let's do that. A mutation function is going to take one argument, and this is going to be a page, and then this page is going to be a string. Now I want to return fetch /API /pages. And I want my method to be post, and I want my body to be JSON.stringify, and then I'm just going to stringify an object that includes the page. So I want to provide another property inside of this useMutation object here, and this is going to be onSuccess. And on success, I'm going to get the response. I'm going to get the body is equal to response.body. I want to get the page, const page is equal to body.page. Let's go have a look at our create page function to make sure we're doing this correctly. And we actually take a handle, not a page, and we return a handle. So let's go fix that up. So we're going to include a handle in our body, and then we're going to get a page out of our response here. Now our response body here is going to be a readable stream. And we know what to do with readable streams because we've dealt with this a few times before. We need to use our extract body function. So I'm going to say await extract body. And then we're going to just wrap the response inside of extract body. And this, of course, now needs to be an async function. And TypeScript is complaining because our response here is of type response, but extract body takes a type of next request. But we can go in here and we can say that this is going to be either a next request or a response. And now TypeScript is going to be happy with this. Okay, so if we get our handle, we just want to redirect the user to that page. So let's import a router so we can do a redirect. So const router is equal to use router, and use router comes from next/router. Execute that. And I just want to say router.push. And I want to push the user to /handle. And now this mutation is ready for us to use inside of our form. On this mutation, we get a few properties. So we can say mutation.loading. And if it is loading, then I just want to display some text that says loading. So I can say p loading. Actually, let's say your page is being created. Okay, so if we're not loading, then I want to show the form. So I want to say if not, mutation.isLoading. Then I want to show a div. And inside of that div, I'm going to have a form. Inside of the form, I want to have a div. And inside of that div, I'm going to have a label. The label is just going to say handle. I can say HTML4 is equal to handle. And HTML4 is just going to render as a for attribute. And then under the label, I want to have a text input. I'm going to give this an ID of handle to match the HTML4 here. I'm going to give it a name of handle. The type is just going to be text. And then the placeholder is just going to be @TomDoesTech, because that is my Twitter handle. And if you're not following me on Twitter, make sure you go over to Twitter and give me a follow. And I'm also going to make this required. So let's go over to localhost port 3000. You can see we have our ask anonymously, and we have a handle, and we have an input here. So that is working quite well. The next thing I want is a button to submit the form. So I'm going to wrap this in a div. Button. And then the button text is just going to be create page. And the type is going to be submit. So when we click this, it actually submits the form. Okay, but when we do submit the form, what is going to happen? Well, I want to call a function called handle submit. So I'm going to define a function handle submit. And this is going to get an event. So I can type this event out as form event. And then that form event is going to be a generic that takes a type of HTML form element. So I can say form event. And form event comes from React. You can see that it is imported here from React. Now this is a generic, so we can say it's type of HTML form element. So when we submit this form, usually in HTML, it's going to refresh the page, but we don't want to do that. Instead, we want to prevent that default behavior. So I can say event.prevent default, and then this is going to stop the page from refreshing. Next, I can say const data is equal to new form data. And I want to get the event.target as HTML form element. So this is going to create a new form data instance with our event from our target form. And from there, we can extract our handle. So I can say const handle is equal to data.get, and we can get our handle. And the reason that we have this property here is because on our input, we supplied a name of handle. Okay, so we can say if not handle, then I just want to return out of this function. I don't want to do anything else. Otherwise, I want to call my mutation with my handle. So I'm going to say mutation.mutate, and I want to call that with handle. Okay, so now we need to use this handle submit function. So I'm going to come down to the form and I will say on submit is equal to handle submit. And TypeScript is complaining here because this is going to be form data entry value, but instead up the top here inside of our mutation, we expect a string. And so we can just cast this to a string and TypeScript is going to be happy. So let's go try out this form. I'm going to refresh here. And inside of the input, this might be a little bit hard to see when it's completely unstyled. I'm just going to say Tom. Let's click create page. We see your page is being created, and then we should get redirected to this page for Tom. And of course we get a 404 because we don't have a page inside of our pages directory to handle these handle pages. Before we go make that page, let's go through and quickly add some styles to this, just so it's a little bit easier to see. So onside of the main, I'm going to add a text center class, and also going to give this a padding of 4. You can see when I type P here, I get these IntelliSense suggestions here. And that is because I have an extension installed called Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. If you're using Tailwind and you don't have this plugin installed, make sure you go get it installed as soon as possible because it's going to make your life much easier. So I'm going to give this a padding of 4. And then for the H1, I'm going to give this some classes. I'm going to give this a margin bottom of 4, a text size of 4 XL, a font is going to be extra bold, and then in dark, I want this to be text white. So this is meant to be dark. Go look at that. Okay, so this is looking better already. Let's go style this part of the form a little bit. So on the div that's wrapping the form, I'm going to give this some class names of W full. So the width is going to be full, flex and justify center. The form is going to have width full, and max width is going to be extra small. And then on the div that wraps the input element, I'm going to give this a margin bottom of 4. Then on the label, I'm going to give this a class name of block so we can display block. Text is going to be gray 700. The text is going to be small and the font is going to be bold. And then we're going to give it a margin bottom of 2. For the input, I want to have a little shadow. So I'm going to say shadow, a border, and that border is going to be rounded. The width is going to be full. The padding on the y-axis, I'm going to give that a 2. And the padding on the x-axis, I'm going to give that a 3. Again, the text is going to be gray 700. And let's go check that. That should look okay. Okay, yep, that looks okay. So let's go style the button really quickly. Class name is equal to, I'm going to give this a background of blue 500. A rounded. Let's also give it a shadow. The text is going to be white. Let's give it a padding on the y-axis of 2, a padding on the x-axis of 4. And let's check that. It's almost there. I just want to move this form into the center here. And the way that I'm going to do that is fixing this class name here. So this isn't just center, it's justify center. Okay, so this is looking much more presentable. Let's create a new handle. So Tom2. So the next thing we need to do is to go and create the page for these handles. Let's come back over to our application, and inside of our pages directory, I'm going to create a new file, and this is going to be called bracket handle bracket.tsx. And what this is telling Next is this handle here is going to be dynamic. So I'm going to export default function handle page. And then for now, I'm just going to return a div with hello world. And we come back over, we no longer get a 404. Instead, we get this text of hello world. Let's go over to our index page, and I just want to copy everything inside of this main, and then we can modify that because we've already built out a form that we can use. So actually, let's just copy everything in the return block, paste that in. Instead of create page, this is going to be ask anonymously. And instead of a handle, this is going to be a comment. And then the placeholder is going to be, how old are you? As a little sample comment there that they can post. I also want to change the ID to comment and then the name to comment as well. So we need to create a handle submit function. So I'm going to say function handle submit. And then we also need to create a mutation. So I'm going to say const mutation is equal to use mutation. We're going to supply an object to use mutation. And inside of this object, we're going to have our handle function and our onSuccess function. So I'm going to say mutation function. And this mutation function is going to look very similar to when we created a page. Instead, we're going to get a comment that's going to be a string. I'm going to say return fetch, and we're going to use the fetch API. And we're going to send a post request to /API/comments. The method is going to be post, and then the body is going to be JSON.stringify, and we need to put in our comment. And let's go have a look at what this API takes. Create comment takes a page and a comment. So we need to get our page. We can do that with our router. So I want to say const router is equal to use router. From our router, we can get our handle. So I'm going to say const handle is equal to router.query.handle. And I just want to cast that as a string. Now we can pass our handle into the body of this function here. So we want an onSuccess function, and we want our onSuccess function to just refetch all of the comments. This is the lazy way to do it. You could modify the cache manually, but I don't think it's really worth doing that right now. It's a bit of a premature optimization. In order to refetch, we need to have a query to refetch. So let's go create that query. So we'll say const object is equal to use query. And I want to give this query a string of handle, and then it's going to be their handle. And this is the cache key. This is going to tell React Query what key to use when caching the response of this query. And we need to give it a function that tells React Query how to fetch this data. So I want to return fetch. And this is going to be process.env.next public Vercel URL. And we need to make this the actual value. So next public Vercel URL is going to be the URL where your application is running. Vercel is going to inject this for you, and so you don't need to set this URL. But we do need to have this here because fetch requests require an absolute URL. You cannot use a relative URL in that you couldn't have your URL be /comments. It needs to be http:/localhost 3000/comments. This is what I mean when I say it needs to be an absolute URL. So this is going to make a GET request to our Vercel URL /API/comments. And then we put a query string on here. So we need to add a query string. And this is going to be handle equals our handle. So go back to our comments, and inside of our read, we use the term page here. Let's instead, inside of here, rename this to page equals our handle. Okay, so we need to return the response JSON. So I'm going to call .then. I'm going to get my response, and this is going to be res.json, and then we're going to execute that JSON function. Now I want to create a type for a comment, so I can return this response here as that type, and then we're going to infer that type in our data that we get out of useQuery here. So let's say type comment is equal to an object. We're going to have an ID, and that's going to be a string. We're going to have a comment that is going to be a string, and then we're also going to have created at, and that is going to be a string. If you're wondering where I got these properties from, if we go back to our API route for comments, you can see inside of our GET request here, that's what we selected here. So it's going to be our ID, comment, and created at. You could select star here, but that's generally bad practice because you don't want to over select. Okay, so I'm just going to typecast the response JSON here as a promise, and the promise is going to be of type comment, and it's going to be an array of type comment. Now, if we have a look at our data, you can see that our data is either undefined or an array of comments, and that's exactly what we want. If we remove this here for a second, you can see that our data here is of type any, and that's not what we want. So useQuery is going to return a few different properties. One is data, and this is going to be our comments. The other one is a refetch function, which is just going to refetch this query here when we execute that function. We also get an isLoading property and an isError property. So now that we can come back to our useMutation, and we can say on success. So when the user posts a comment, then we just want to refetch all of the comments. So I want to provide an async function here. Actually, this doesn't need to be async. And I just want to execute refetch. Okay, so the next thing to do is to implement our handle submit function. So again, in here, we're going to get an event. This is going to be a form event. And again, we're going to use a HTML form element. We're going to call event.preventDefaults because remember, we don't want the page to refresh when we submit this form. We say const data is equal to new form data event.target as HTML form element. I want to extract my comment outside of this data property. So I'm going to say const comment is equal to data.get. And I want to get my comment. I'm going to say if not comment, then again, we're just going to return. So if the comment block is empty, and we can cast this as a string. In fact, what we should be doing is saying if not comment.trim, or we could trim this up here. So if the user just puts in some space. So if the user just puts in blank space, then we're not going to create a comment with just white space in there. So we can't call .trim here because it's not a string yet. So instead we can say wrap all of this and then call .trim, and then that should trim any white space. Okay, and then all we need to do is call mutation.mutate, and then I want to mutate with my comment. So this mutate is going to call this mutation function here, and it's going to pass in the comment. So let's collapse the form here. And for now, I just want to json.stringify, and I want to stringify the data here so we can make sure everything is working correctly. And if it is, we can map through our comments and show them on the page. So I'm going to ask my comment, how old are you? Ask anonymously, and it says my comment is being created. So we get an error here, and this looks like a Zod error, and it's saying invalid type must be string and the path is page. So let's go back to our comment where we call mutation. And it looks like we need this to be page, not handle. So let's rename that to page. And the value is going to be handle. We'll try this again. So we're not getting any comments on the page. And if we look at the network request, you can see that we have one where the page is undefined. We don't want that. And then we also get a 404 for the page of Tom2. That's not what we expect to happen. So let's go have a look and see what is happening. So to fix the first issue where we're making a query where the handle is undefined, instead of returning this function here, I can cut this fetch object out and I can remove the key from here. Just going to move that up so I don't lose that. And I want to use query, and this is going to be an object. And inside of that object, I'm going to have a query function, and that is going to be my fetch function. Then I want to have a query key, and that is going to be this key here. And then I can provide an enabled property, and my enabled property is going to be if we have a handle. So I'm just going to cast handle to a Boolean. And so if it's undefined, this Boolean is going to resolve to false. But if it's a string in that we've actually resolved the handle from the query, then this query here is going to be enabled. So query function is complaining here, and that's because we need to return a function that returns our fetch function. So we can just put this little function syntax here, and that is going to return this fetch function. So let's clear these network requests and refresh. And I'm going to filter this, and you can see that we don't fetch for undefined, but we're still getting a 404 where our page is equal to Tom2. And we know that this page does exist because we created it. So I'm just going to log this query out. So console.log. Go back and refresh, and then we can come back and see. So we're getting a 404, but we don't see this console log, which means that I think we're sending the request to the wrong endpoint. So you can see that we're sending it to undefined. And if we have a look at what precedes /API/comments, it is our next public Vercel URL. So Vercel is going to inject this environment variable when we deploy our application, but we're not in a deployed environment. We're in our local environment. So let's go into our end.local. And we can populate this, and this is going to equal HTTP localhost port 3000. Save that, and let's try this again. Refresh, and now we get some data. So we can go map through these comments and display them nicely on the page. So while we're here, we can say your comment is being created. And if they have posted a comment, then I don't want to show the form again. So on our mutation, we get another property, and that is success. So I can say mutation.isSuccess. And that means, has this mutation been successfully called? And if it has, then let's not show this form anymore. Okay, so I want to say data.map. And of course, data may be undefined. And so we need this little question mark here. Let's provide map with a callback function. And inside of our callback function, I want to return a line item. Actually, let's just return a div. And this is going to be a comment. And you can see that this is nicely typed here as comment. So I want to say comment.comment as the body. And then we need to provide a key. And this key is just going to be comment. And then I want to say comment.id. You don't need this comment string here. I just add this out of habit in case you map through an element twice on a page. And then under the comment, I want to have a break tag, and I want to have a span. Inside of the span, I want to have a new date. And inside of that new date, I want to have comment.createdAt. And then I want to cast this to date string. Let's go have a look at this. And you can see that we have how old are you with this Saturday, July 8th at 2023. So we can remove this stringify here. And then the last thing we need to do is to just style this comment here. So I want to add a class name. And I want to say the background is gray 100. I want to say rounded is going to be large. So the border radius is going to be large. I want to add a large shadow as well. And the max width is going to be medium. And the margin on the X is going to be auto, and this is going to get it to center. Then I'm going to give it a margin on the Y axis of 4. And then I want to give our span a class name as well. This is going to be text gray 500. Text is going to be right. And I want to say text small as well. And this mutation is success needs to be if it's not mutation.isSuccess. So if we haven't called it successfully, then we want to show the form. Okay, so let's ask another question. We can ask that. We're going to refetch, and then we're going to get our other question at the top here. So I've made one mistake here. These URLs do not need to be absolute. They can in fact be relative. So let's remove this process.env here and make that a little bit simpler. Now, the last thing to do is to deploy our application and verify that it works. And we can do that with our Vercel command. So I'm going to type Vercel, and this is going to create a new deployment for us. We can inspect that deployment by clicking this link here. So once our deployment has finished, we can click on visit here. And then I'm going to add a new page. And we can ask a question now. So this is going to be first question. And then this is going to refetch our data, and we're going to see our first question here. Let's refresh again. We can ask a new question. This is going to refetch again, and then we should see our new question. So that is how to build and deploy a full stack application to the edge. Thank you again to Neon for sponsoring this video. If you liked this video, please make sure you leave a thumbs up and let me know in the comment section below what you're going to build with Neon serverless driver and Vercel edge functions. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.